The gunshot echoed through the quiet Colorado morning, shattering the peace of Ruby Lane's life as surely as it shattered the kitchen window behind her. She ducked instinctively, heart hammering against her ribs as she peered through the curtains of her modest homestead to see her husband, Victor, laughing raucously with a strange woman on the back of his horse. The year was 1878, and at 24, Ruby had just discovered her husband's betrayal in the most terrifying way possible. "Victor," she screamed, storming onto the porch of their small ranch house, wheat-colored hair flying loose from its pins. "What in heaven's name are you doing?" The man who had vowed to love her forever fixed her with a cold stare she'd never seen before. "Teaching you a lesson, Ruby. Think I didn't know about those letters you've been hiding?" Ruby froze, her blood turning to ice. The letters from her cousin in Denver had been her only connection to family since Victor had moved them to this isolated stretch of land 2 years ago, cutting her off from everyone she knew. "They are from my cousin Mary," she said, her voice trembling. "You know that." Victor's companion, a woman with unnaturally red hair and a tight-fitting dress that no respectable frontier woman would wear, cackled. "He don't believe that story anymore, honey." "I've had enough of your lies," Victor snarled, raising his pistol again. "I'm taking what's valuable from this house, and me and Loretta here are heading to California. You can rot out here for all I care." Ruby couldn't move as Victor dismounted and pushed past her into the house. The sound of breaking glass and furniture being overturned filled the air as he ransacked their home. When he emerged, their lockbox was tucked under his arm, containing every cent they had saved over 2 years of backbreaking work. "Victor, please," Ruby begged, reaching for his arm. "That's everything we have." His backhand caught her across the face with enough force to send her sprawling in the dirt. Blood pooled in her mouth as she looked up at the man she'd trusted with her life. "Should have thought about that before you started sneaking around," he spat. Ruby watched, tears streaming down her dirt-smudged face as her husband mounted his horse, pulled the strange woman up behind him, and galloped away, taking with him her savings, her security, and her trust in love. 3 days later, Ruby hadn't left the house. Food supplies were dwindling, and the devastation Victor had left in his wake was overwhelming. The kitchen table was overturned, dishes smashed across the floor. He'd taken their only horse, leaving her stranded miles from the nearest town. With no way to communicate and no means of transportation, she was effectively trapped. On the 4th morning, as Ruby sat on the porch steps contemplating her fate, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon. Her heart leapt to her throat. Was Victor returning? Had he changed his mind? Part of her hoped, while another part feared what his return might mean. But as the rider drew closer, she realized it wasn't Victor at all. The stranger rode tall in the saddle, his broad-shouldered frame silhouetted against the rising sun. He slowed his horse as he approached, and Ruby instinctively retreated toward the door, wishing she knew where Victor had hidden his spare pistol. "Madam," the stranger called, stopping a respectful distance away. "Don't mean to intrude, but I'm looking for the Lane property." Ruby stared at him suspiciously. "This is it. What's your business here?" The man removed his hat, revealing sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. "Name's Tanner Grayson. I've been hired to help with the summer cattle drive. Mr. Lane arranged it before heading to Denver." Ruby nearly choked on her bitter laugh. "Mr. Lane won't be returning from Denver or anywhere else. He's gone to California with another woman after stealing everything of value." Tanner Grayson's expression shifted from polite inquiry to concern. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mrs. Lane." "Are you all right? You look like you could use some help." Ruby straightened her spine, pride rising through her despair. "I don't need charity, Mr. Grayson." "It's not charity I'm offering," he said, dismounting with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent his life on horseback. "I signed a contract with Lane Ranch for the summer. Way I see it, I still owe that work, contract or no." For the first time, Ruby noticed the deep lines etched around his eyes, suggesting he was older than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 or so. He wasn't handsome in the conventional way Victor had been, but there was something steady in his gaze that made her pause. "There's nothing here for you, Mr. Grayson. My husband took our savings, and there's barely enough food for me, let alone hired help." Tanner glanced around, taking in the broken window, the scattered belongings on the porch, and the absence of livestock beyond a few chickens scratching in the dirt. "Begging your pardon, madam, but it looks to me like there's plenty that needs doing." He gestured toward his saddlebags. "I've got provisions to last a week, and I know how to hunt. Let me help get this place back in order, and then I'll be on my way if you still want me gone." Ruby hesitated. She trusted a man once before, and it had left her broken. But she was also practical enough to know she couldn't survive alone much longer. "1 week," she said finally. "But I can't pay you." Tanner nodded, a slight smile touching the corners of his mouth. "I don't recall asking for payment, Mrs. Lane." That first day, Tanner Grayson worked from sunrise to sunset. He repaired the broken window with materials from his saddlebag, righted the furniture Victor had overturned, and hunted a rabbit for their evening meal. He spoke little, focusing on the work with a quiet intensity that Ruby found unsettling only because it was so different from Victor's constant chatter and promises. As darkness fell, Ruby stood awkwardly in the kitchen, watching Tanner wash up at the pump outside. "You can take the barn loft," she said when he returned. "It's clean and there's a bedroll up there." "Much obliged," he replied, his voice a low rumble that somehow put her at ease despite her distrust. That night, Ruby lay awake in her bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person on her property. Part of her kept expecting to hear footsteps approaching the house, kept expecting Tanner to reveal himself as no better than Victor. But the only sound was the occasional soft shuffling from the barn as he settled in for the night. In the days that followed, a rhythm developed. Tanner rose before dawn, tended to his horse and the chickens, then set about the endless tasks of ranch maintenance. By the third day, he'd repaired the corral fence, cleared the overgrown garden patch, and hunted enough game to fill Ruby's depleted pantry. Ruby, for her part, moved through her days in a fog of betrayal and uncertainty. She cooked meals for them both, washed clothes, and attempted to restore order to the house. But her mind kept returning to Victor's accusations and the violent way he'd left her. On the fifth day, as Ruby hung laundry on the line behind the house, she found herself watching Tanner split wood with smooth, powerful strokes. Sweat glistened on his forearms, and his concentration never wavered as the pile of firewood grew. "Why are you really here, Mr. Grayson?" She called suddenly, surprising herself with the directness of the question. Tanner paused, resting the axe head on the chopping block. "Told you, Mrs. Lane, I made a commitment to a man who's no longer here," she countered. "Most would consider that commitment null and void." He wiped his brow with his sleeve. "My pa taught me a man's word is all he has in this world. Besides," he added, a hint of something like compassion flickering in his eyes, "seems like you could use an extra pair of hands right now." Ruby turned away, blinking back unexpected tears. "My husband believed I was unfaithful to him. That's why he left." "Were you?" Tanner asked, his voice neutral. "No," Ruby whispered, clutching a damp shirt in her trembling hands. "The letters he found were from my cousin. He was always jealous, always suspicious." "I think he was looking for an excuse." Tanner was quiet for a long moment. "Some men look for reasons to do what they already wanted to do," he finally said. "Don't make it your burden to carry." That night, a storm rolled in from the mountains. Rain pounded the roof as Ruby huddled in her bed, listening to the thunder shake the walls of the small house. A particularly violent gust of wind tore at the newly repaired window, and she heard the distinct crack of glass breaking again. Wrapping her shawl around her nightgown, Ruby hurried to the kitchen, only to find Tanner already there, securing a piece of oilcloth over the broken pane. "Storm caught it just right," he explained, his hair dripping rainwater onto his shoulders. "I'll fix it proper tomorrow." Lightning illuminated the kitchen, casting sharp shadows across his face. For a moment, Ruby saw him clearly, not just the capable ranch hand, but a man with his own story etched into the lines around his eyes and mouth. "You should go back to the barn before you catch your death," she said, aware suddenly of her thin nightgown beneath the shawl. Tanner's eyes remained respectfully on her face. "Barn roof's got a leak. I was heading to the porch to wait it out." Ruby hesitated only a moment. "You can sleep by the fire in here. It's foolish to sit outside in this weather." He nodded his thanks, and Ruby retreated to her room, hyper-aware of the man settling himself on the floor of her kitchen. It should have frightened her, having a near stranger in her house as she slept. Instead, she found herself relaxing to the rhythm of the rain, feeling safer than she had since Victor's departure. The week Tanner had promised stretched into 2. Neither of them mentioned his departure date again. Instead, they fell into a pattern of shared work and quiet meals. Ruby found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, the careful way he handled her china, how he always removed his hat before entering the house, the gentleness with which he treated her chickens, and his own horse. "We need to talk about what comes next," Tanner said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold. Ruby's stomach clenched. "You're leaving?" "No," he said, surprising her. "But winter will be here before we know it, and you need more than just chickens to survive it." She corrected him softly, not meeting his eyes. Tanner's gaze remained on the horizon. "If you'll have me stay, yes, we need to consider our options." The practical discussion that followed was both a relief and a revelation to Ruby. Tanner laid out a plan to acquire a milk cow and some goats, to expand the garden, to possibly take on work at neighboring ranches to earn money for supplies they couldn't produce themselves. He talked about we and us with such simple certainty that Ruby found herself believing in a future she hadn't been able to imagine a week earlier. "Why are you doing this?" she asked when he'd finished outlining his plans. "You don't owe me anything." Tanner was quiet for a long moment. "First time I rode up, I saw a woman who'd been broken but wasn't beaten. Reminded me of my ma after my pa died. She had the same look, like the world had kicked her down, but she was too stubborn to stay there. What happened to her? Your mother. Rebuilt everything from nothing," he said, a note of pride in his voice. "Taught me that the measure of a person isn't what knocks them down, but how they get back up." Ruby thought about that long after they'd retired for the night. Tanner to the barn loft that he'd improved with proper walls and a better roof. She to the bedroom that no longer felt haunted by Victor's presence. The next morning, Ruby woke with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since before Victor left. She dressed with care in her sturdiest skirt and blouse, pinned her hair neatly, and prepared a hearty breakfast before Tanner even came in from his morning chores. "We're going to town today," she announced as he washed up for breakfast. Tanner raised an eyebrow. "That's a fair ride without a wagon. You sure? Your horse can carry double," she said with more confidence than she felt. "And I need to speak to the banker. Victor may have taken our savings, but this property is half mine by law." A smile spread slowly across Tanner's face. "Yes, madam." The ride to Silver Creek took nearly 2 hours, with Ruby perched uncomfortably behind Tanner on his gelding. She was acutely aware of the impropriety of their position, her arms around his waist, her chest pressed against his back, but the alternative was remaining isolated at the ranch, and that was no longer acceptable. Silver Creek was a small but growing town, with a general store, a bank, a hotel, and the inevitable saloon. As they rode down the main street, Ruby felt the weight of curious stares. It had been months since she'd been to town, and now she arrived riding double with a man who wasn't her husband. "Ignore them," Tanner said quietly as he helped her down from the horse. "You've got nothing to be ashamed of." Ruby squared her shoulders and marched into the bank, where Mr. Hoffman, the portly banker who'd handled their account since they'd arrived, looked up in surprise. "Mrs. Lane. We'd heard troubling news. Your husband has abandoned his property and his wife," Ruby finished firmly, "and I'm here to discuss my options." The conversation that followed was both humiliating and empowering. Yes, as a married woman, Ruby had limited legal rights to the property without her husband's signature. No, there was no money left in their account. Victor had withdrawn it all 3 days before he left. Yes, if Victor didn't return within 1 year and 1 day, Ruby could petition for abandonment. "But in the meantime," Mr. Hoffman explained, looking uncomfortably at Tanner, who stood silently by the door, "you have no legal standing to take out loans or sell the property." Ruby felt her newfound confidence wavering. "So I'm to simply wait a year with no means of support." "The law assumes a husband will provide," Hoffman said apologetically. "And when he doesn't," Ruby demanded. It was Tanner who broke the uncomfortable silence that followed. The cattle drive to Denver leaves in 2 weeks. They're still hiring experienced hands. I could go send money back. Ruby turned to him, startled. But that would leave me alone again. Just for 6 weeks, he assured her. And you'd have funds to last the winter. Back outside in the bright sunlight, Ruby felt the curious stares more keenly. A woman approached them, Mrs. Bennett, the minister's wife, who had once invited Ruby to join the ladies' sewing circle before Victor had forbidden it. Ruby Lane, she said, her expression a mix of concern and disapproval. We've all been so worried. And who might this be? Ruby hesitated only a moment. This is Tanner Grayson. He's been helping at the ranch since Victor left. Mrs. Bennett's eyebrows nearly reached her hairline. Is that appropriate, my dear? A young woman alone with a man who is not her husband. I sleep in the barn, madam, Tanner said respectfully but firmly. And Mrs. Lane has conducted herself with nothing but propriety. Mrs. Bennett sniffed. Nevertheless, appearances matter. Perhaps Ruby should consider staying in town with a respectable family until her situation is resolved. Thank you for your concern, Ruby said, finding strength in her rising indignation, but I have a home to maintain. Good day, Mrs. Bennett. As they walked toward the general store, Ruby felt a curious lightness in her chest, despite the encounter. She had defended her choices, however unconventional they might appear to others. In the store, they purchased essential supplies: flour, coffee, salt, ammunition for hunting, careful with the limited funds Tanner had brought. As the shopkeeper tallied their purchases, the bell over the door jingled, and a familiar voice made Ruby freeze. Well, if it isn't the abandoned wife. She turned slowly to face Loretta, the woman who had ridden away with Victor. The woman looked harder in the daylight, her painted face showing lines that powder couldn't hide. Where is Victor? Ruby asked, hating the tremor in her voice. Loretta shrugged, eyeing Tanner with obvious interest. Headed for California, last I saw. Left me in Denver when a better opportunity came along. Her lip curled. Men like him always do. Ruby felt Tanner move closer to her side, a silent presence of support. I'm sorry to hear that, she said, surprising herself with the sincerity of the words. Loretta's expression shifted from mockery to something almost like respect. Don't waste your sorry on me, honey. I knew what he was. Did you get to keep anything worth having? More than you might think, Ruby replied, turning back to the shopkeeper. We'll take these items now, please. As they rode back to the ranch, Ruby sat in silence, processing the day's events. Tanner didn't press her to talk, but his presence was steady and reassuring. Will you really go on the cattle drive? She finally asked as the ranch came into view. If you think it's best, he answered. We need the money and it's honest work. The we settled around Ruby like a warm blanket. I've been thinking, she said carefully. Perhaps we could offer room and board to another ranch hand or two for help with rebuilding. There must be men looking for work who would accept lodging and meals as partial payment. Tanner nodded thoughtfully. That's good thinking. We could put up a proper bunkhouse before winter, make it a working ranch again by spring. It was never much of a working ranch, Ruby admitted. Victor talked big, but he didn't like the actual work. We had a few head of cattle when we first arrived, but he sold them for cash within months. Man like that doesn't deserve to call himself a rancher, Tanner said, the first truly judgmental words he'd spoken about Victor. That evening, as they ate a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Ruby found herself studying Tanner's face in the lamplight. The past 2 weeks had changed something fundamental in her world. Where there had been betrayal and despair, now there was possibility. Tell me about your life before you came here, she said impulsively. Tanner looked up, surprise flickering across his face. Not much to tell. Born in Texas, moved north with my folks when I was 10. Pa had a small spread in Wyoming until a bad winter took him and most of our stock. Ma kept us going until my sister and I were grown. I've been working cattle drives and ranch jobs since I was 16. And you never wanted your own place. His eyes met hers, steady and honest. Never found a place worth putting down roots. The words hung between them, loaded with unspoken meaning. Ruby looked away first, her cheeks warming. I'm turning in, she said, rising to clear the dishes. We have a lot to do tomorrow if you're serious about leaving for the cattle drive. Tanner stood as well, taking his hat from its peg by the door. I am, and when I get back, we'll start building something here worth keeping. The 2 weeks before Tanner's departure passed in a flurry of activity. They posted notices at the general store and saloon for ranch hands willing to work for room and board, plus a small wage once the cattle drive money came in. To Ruby's surprise, they received responses from 3 men, a father and son from a failed homestead further north, and an older cowhand looking for steady work as his riding days waned. Tanner interviewed each carefully, assessing not just their skills but their character. "They'll be here with you while I'm gone," he explained. "Need to be sure they're trustworthy." The day before Tanner was set to leave for the cattle drive, the new hands arrived Samuel Whitaker and his 19-year-old son James, followed by Edgar Morris, a weathered cowboy in his 50s with a bad knee but a lifetime of ranch experience. They set up temporary quarters in the barn while plans were made for a proper bunkhouse. That evening, after the newcomers had settled in, Ruby found Tanner sitting on the porch steps, staring at the darkening mountains. "You've changed everything," she said softly, sitting beside him. He shook his head. "You were already changing things when I arrived. I just lent a hand." Ruby looked down at her own hands, work roughened but capable. "I was raised to believe a woman's place was to support her husband's dreams. It never occurred to me to have dreams of my own until Victor left." "And now," Tanner asked, his voice gentle in the gathering dusk, "now I dream of building something that's mine, something no one can take away." His hand covered hers briefly, a touch so light it might have been imagined. "That's worth working for." The morning of Tanner's departure dawned clear and cool. Ruby rose early to prepare a substantial breakfast for all the men, but her mind was on the 6 weeks that stretched ahead without Tanner's steady presence. "Samuel knows what needs doing on the north fence," Tanner said as he saddled his horse. "Edgar's drawing up plans for the bunkhouse. James can help you with anything around the house." Ruby nodded, fighting an inexplicable urge to ask him to stay. "We'll manage." He swung into the saddle with practiced ease, looking down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I'll be back before first snow. That's a promise." "Be safe," she said, stepping back as he turned his horse toward the trail. She watched until he was just a speck on the horizon, then turned back to her ranch with a determination that surprised her. There was work to be done, and she wouldn't waste the opportunity Tanner had helped create. The weeks without Tanner passed more quickly than Ruby had anticipated. Samuel and James Whitaker proved to be hardworking and respectful, tackling the fence repairs and helping prepare the garden for winter. Edgar, despite his bad knee, was a fountain of knowledge about ranch operations and began teaching Ruby about cattle management and breeding, knowledge she absorbed eagerly. Each evening, Ruby would sit on the porch and look toward the trail where Tanner had disappeared, wondering where he was, if he was safe, and why his absence left such an ache in her chest. It was Edgar who finally addressed what everyone seemed to sense. "That Grayson fella," he said one evening as they sat around the kitchen table after supper. "He's a good man." Ruby looked up from her mending. "Yes, he is. Known many cowboys in my day," Edgar continued, packing his pipe carefully. "Most are drifters at heart. But that one he's looking for a place to land. Mr. Grayson has been very kind," Ruby said neutrally, aware of Samuel and James listening. Edgar struck a match, puffing his pipe to life. "Kindness is one thing, the way he looks at you is another." Ruby felt heat rise to her face. "Mr. Morris, just stating facts, madam," the older man said with a shrug. "And the fact is, that man didn't ride out on a cattle drive for the money alone." Later, alone in her bedroom, Ruby found herself touching the simple gold band she still wore. Victor had been gone nearly 2 months now, with no word, no sign he ever intended to return. Yet she remained legally his wife, bound by vows he had so easily discarded. And then there was Tanner Steadfast, honest Tanner, who had asked for nothing but had given her back her sense of possibility. She couldn't deny the flutter in her chest when she thought of him, or the way her days seemed dimmer without his quiet presence. "It's too soon," she whispered to herself in the darkness, "and you're still married." But her heart, so recently shattered, was slowly reforming into something stronger. with pieces of Tanner Grayson fitted carefully alongside her own renewed sense of self. 5 weeks after Tanner's departure, disaster struck. Ruby was in the garden harvesting the last of the autumn vegetables when she heard James Whittaker shout from the north pasture. Looking up, she saw smoke rising above the trees, a wildfire, moving fast with the dry autumn wind. "Fire," Samuel called, running from the barn. "Miss Ruby, we need to clear a fire break before it reaches the house." The next hours were a blur of desperate activity. Edgar organized them into teams, using the plow to turn up a wide swath of earth between the approaching fire and the buildings. Ruby worked alongside the men, filling buckets from the well to soak the roof of the house and barn. As dusk fell, the fire reached the edge of their hastily constructed barrier. Sparks flew across the turned earth, igniting small spot fires that they rushed to extinguish. The smoke was suffocating, the heat intense even from a distance. "If the wind shifts," Edgar shouted over the roar of the flames, "we'll lose it all." Ruby stared at the approaching wall of fire, despair threatening to overwhelm her. After everything, Victor's betrayal, the struggle to survive, the hard work to rebuild, would it all be lost in a single night? And then, through the smoke and darkness, came the thunder of hooves. A group of riders appeared, led by a familiar broad-shouldered figure who leapt from his horse before it had fully stopped. "Tanner," Ruby cried, relief washing over her. "Saw the smoke from the valley," he shouted, already directing the men who had arrived with him, other cowboys returning from the cattle drive. "Got help from the Flying J on the way." With the additional hands, they worked through the night to contain the fire. Tanner organized bucket lines, sent men to dig additional fire breaks, and worked tirelessly alongside everyone else. By dawn, the danger had passed. The fire had burned itself out against their defenses, leaving the ranch buildings untouched though blackened with soot. As the sun rose, casting golden light over the charred landscape, Ruby found Tanner slumped against the well, exhaustion etched into every line of his body. His face was streaked with soot, his clothes singed in places. "You came back early," she said, offering him a dipper of water. He drank deeply before answering. "Got paid and headed straight back. Good thing, too." Ruby sank down beside him, her own exhaustion catching up. "If you hadn't arrived when you did." "But I did," he said simply. Without thinking, Ruby reached out and touched his smoke-smudged cheek. "Thank you." Something shifted in his eyes, a warmth that had nothing to do with the still smoldering landscape around them. His hand came up to cover hers, holding it against his face for a moment before gently lowering it. "You should rest," he said, his voice rough from smoke and something else. "I'll check the perimeter one more time." In the days that followed, the ranch slowly recovered from the fire. The men built the planned bunkhouse with renewed urgency, using some of Tanner's cattle drive earnings to purchase lumber from town. Ruby found herself watching Tanner as he worked, the strength in his hands, the quiet way he led without demanding, the respect he showed to everyone around him. She also noticed how he never touched her, never stood too close, maintaining a careful distance that hadn't been there before the fire. It both relieved and disappointed her. One evening, as the first snow of the season dusted the mountains, Ruby sat on the porch wrapped in a shawl, watching the sunset paint the snow-capped peaks pink and gold. Tanner emerged from the newly completed bunkhouse and paused when he saw her. "Mind some company?" he asked, standing at the bottom of the steps. "Please," she said, indicating the space beside her. He sat, leaving a respectable distance between them. For a while, they simply watched the changing colors of the sunset in companionable silence. "Edgar tells me you've been learning about cattle management," Tanner finally said. Ruby nodded. "He's a good teacher. We've been discussing which breeds might do well here." "You're thinking of rebuilding the herd?" "I am," she said with quiet determination. "This spring, if we can afford it." Tanner smiled, the expression softening the hard planes of his face. "You've come a long way from the woman I met 3 months ago." "I had help," Ruby acknowledged, meeting his gaze. Something unspoken passed between them, a current as tangible as the cold air. "Ruby," Tanner began, then stopped, seeming to search for words. "I've been thinking it might be time for me to move on." The words hit her like a physical blow. Move on, why? He looked out at the darkening landscape, his profile strong against the fading light. People in town are talking. A married woman living with a ranch hand, it's causing gossip that could harm your reputation. I don't care what people say, Ruby said fiercely. You should, Tanner countered gently. You're rebuilding more than just this ranch, you're rebuilding your life here. That means relationships with neighbors, with the town. And what about my relationship with you? Ruby asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tanner's hands tightened into fists on his knees. Ruby, you're married. To a man who abandoned me, who betrayed everything we built together, she said, anger and hurt mingling in her voice. A man I'll likely never see again. The law doesn't see it that way, Tanner said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion, and neither does society. Ruby stood suddenly, wrapping her shawl tighter around herself. So you'll leave, just like Victor did. Tanner rose as well, his height making her tilt her head to maintain eye contact. Nothing like Victor did, he said, a rare flash of anger in his voice. I'm trying to protect you. I don't need protection, Ruby retorted. I need, she broke off, unsure how to finish the sentence. For a long moment they stood facing each other, breath visible in the cold air between them. What do you need, Ruby? Tanner asked quietly. The answer rose within her, clear and undeniable. You, she whispered. I need you. The confession hung in the air, impossible to take back. Tanner's expression shifted from surprise to something deeper, more primal. For one breathless moment, Ruby thought he might close the distance between them. Instead, he took a step back, his face a mask of restraint. Good night, Mrs. Lane, he said formally, and walked away toward the bunkhouse, leaving Ruby alone with the realization that had been building within her for weeks. She was in love with Tanner Grayson. Winter descended on the ranch with icy determination. Snow piled high around the buildings, and the daily work of survival chopping wood, caring for the chickens and Tanner's horse, maintaining the buildings consumed their days. True to his word, Tanner hadn't left, but a new formality had grown between them. He addressed her as Mrs. Lane, took his meals with the other men in the bunkhouse more often than not, and avoided being alone with her when possible. Ruby ached with the distance, but understood its necessity. The feelings between them, for she was certain now they were mutual, could lead nowhere, while she remained legally bound to Victor. December brought holiday preparations. Ruby baked with precious supplies of sugar and dried fruits, determined to create some semblance of Christmas cheer, despite their circumstances. Samuel's son, James, rode to town for mail and supplies, returning with an unexpected letter. It's addressed to you, Miss Ruby, he said, handing her the envelope with Denver postmarks. Ruby opened it with trembling fingers, the men watching curiously as she read. Her face paled, then flushed as she looked up. It's from a lawyer in Denver, she said, her voice unsteady. Victor is dead. A stunned silence fell over the kitchen. Dead, Tanner repeated. How? Shot in a saloon fight 2 weeks ago, Ruby said, scanning the letter again. This lawyer represents a woman claiming to be Victor's wife, a woman he married in Denver last month. Bigamy, Edgar muttered. The scoundrel. Ruby continued reading, her expression shifting from shock to something like grim satisfaction. The lawyer wants to know if I'll contest her claim to Victor's estate. A bitter laugh escaped her, as if Victor had anything worth claiming. That evening, after the others had retired to the bunkhouse, Ruby sat alone by the fire, trying to process the complex emotions stirred by the news of Victor's death. She felt no grief that surprised her less than she might have expected, but neither did she feel the vindication or closure she might have anticipated. A soft knock at the door roused her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Tanner standing in the swirling snow, his hat in his hands. "May I come in?" he asked formally. Ruby stepped aside, suddenly aware of her loosened hair and the robe covering her nightgown. "Is something wrong?" Tanner removed his coat, hanging it carefully by the door. "I wanted to check on you. News like that, it can stir up complicated feelings." "I'm fine," Ruby said automatically, then reconsidered. "No, that's not entirely true. I don't know what I feel. Shouldn't I be sad? He was my husband." Tanner followed her to the fireplace but remained standing while she sat. "There's no right way to feel, Ruby. He hurt you deeply." "Yes," she agreed softly, but I made vows to him before God and witnesses, for better or worse. Vows he broke long before today, Tanner pointed out. Ruby stared into the flames, searching for the right words. The letter changes everything, doesn't it? Tanner was silent for so long that Ruby finally looked up at him. The firelight cast shadows across his face, highlighting the strong line of his jaw, the intensity of his gaze. That depends, he finally said, on what you want to change. The weight of the moment settled around them. Ruby stood slowly, closing the distance between them until she could feel the heat of his body, see the rapid pulse at his throat. I want to stop pretending I don't feel what I feel, she whispered. I want to stop acting like you're just a ranch hand and I'm just your employer. Tanner's hands came up to frame her face, his touch feather-light, as if she might shatter beneath his fingers. Ruby, he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. I've tried so hard to keep my distance. I know, she said, leaning into his touch. I'm asking you to stop trying. His kiss, when it finally came, was gentle yet insistent, a claiming and a surrender all at once. Ruby felt something click into place deep inside her, a piece of herself she hadn't known was missing, until Tanner Grayson rode into her life and began quietly collecting the fragments of her broken heart. When they finally drew apart, breathless and trembling, Tanner rested his forehead against hers. I've wanted to do that since the day of the fire, he confessed. Ruby smiled, a giddy feeling rising in her chest. Only since then, his answering smile was slow and sweet. Maybe longer. But that was when I knew for certain. Knew what? She asked, her hands resting on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. That I was in love with you, he said simply. And that I'd do anything to protect you, including walk away if that was what you needed. Ruby reached up to trace the line of his jaw. What I need is you, Tanner Grayson, here building this ranch with me, making a life together. He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. You're sure it won't be easy. The law might recognize you as a widow now, but the town will talk if we move too quickly. Let them talk, Ruby said with newfound confidence. We know the truth of what's between us. Tanner's expression grew serious. I need you to be certain, Ruby. Because once I claim you as mine, I won't ever let you go. The possessiveness in his voice sent a shiver of pleasure through her. I've never been more certain of anything, she promised. That night, Tanner returned to the bunkhouse, but something fundamental had shifted between them. The pretense was over. They were no longer employer and employee, widow and ranch hand. They were a man and a woman building a future together, step by careful step. As winter's grip tightened on the land, the ranch settled into a rhythm. Ruby's confidence grew as she took on more responsibility for management decisions. Tanner, released from his self-imposed distance, became her partner in every sense but one they had agreed to wait until spring to marry, giving proper respect to convention even as they planned their future together. February brought a thaw and with it, unexpected visitors. Ruby was in the kitchen preparing lunch when she heard horses in the yard. Looking out the window, she saw two men dismounting strangers in town clothes rather than the practical gear of ranch hands. Tanner reached the house first, positioning himself protectively on the porch as the visitors approached. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, his tone polite but wary. The older of the two removed his hat. "We're looking for Mrs. Ruby Lane." "My name is Harold Wilkins, and this is my associate, Mr. Parker. We represent the First Bank of Denver." Ruby stepped onto the porch beside Tanner. "I'm Ruby Lane." Mr. Wilkins nodded respectfully. "Mrs. Lane, we've come regarding the estate of Victor Lane." Ruby's hand found Tanner's, drawing strength from his solid presence. "I received a letter about his death. I understood there was no estate to speak of." "That's what brings us here," Mr. Parker said, producing a leather portfolio. "May we come inside? This is a matter of some delicacy." Around the kitchen table, the bankers explained their presence. "It appears," Mr. Wilkins said carefully, "that your husband opened an account in Denver under a false name. That account contained a substantial sum money we now believe was obtained through various questionable activities." "Fraud, you mean?" Tanner said bluntly. Mr. Wilkins inclined his head. "Indeed. When Mr. Lane died, the authorities began investigating his affairs. They discovered his true identity and you, Mrs. Lane, as his legal wife." Ruby sat very still. The letter mentioned another woman claimed to be his wife. Dolores Hewitt, Mr. Parker supplied. We've determined that marriage was not legal as he was still married to you. What does this mean for Mrs. Lane? Tanner asked, his hand resting protectively on Ruby's shoulder. Mr. Wilkins opened his portfolio. As Mr. Lane's legal widow, Mrs. Lane is entitled to his estate after any proven fraudulent funds are returned to their rightful owners. Ruby blinked in confusion, but if the money was obtained illegally. Not all of it, Mr. Parker clarified. Mr. Lane appears to have been involved in legitimate business ventures as well. Our preliminary accounting suggests there will be approximately $5,000 remaining after all claims are settled. The sum hung in the air, staggering in its implications. $5,000 was a fortune enough to rebuild the ranch properly, to buy cattle, to secure their future beyond anything Ruby had dared hope. There is, of course, the matter of proving your identity and claim, Mr. Wilkins continued. If you could travel to Denver, I'll accompany her, Tanner said immediately. The bankers exchanged glances. And you are? Tanner Grayson, he replied, straightening to his full height. Mrs. Lane's fiancé. Ruby looked up at him, warmth spreading through her chest at the public acknowledgement of their relationship. After the bankers departed, promising to arrange their travel to Denver in the spring when the roads cleared, Ruby and Tanner stood together on the porch, watching the men disappear down the trail. $5,000, Ruby breathed, still unable to fully comprehend it. Changes things, Tanner agreed. A sudden fear gripped Ruby. Will it change us? This ranch was going to be our challenge, our struggle together. Tanner turned to face her fully, his eyes serious. Money doesn't change who we are, Ruby, just makes some things easier. And us? She asked softly. What are we, Tanner? He took her hands in his expression solemn. We're partners. In this ranch, in life, in everything that matters. That's what we've been building these past months, and that's what we'll keep building with or without Victor's money. Ruby searched his face, finding nothing but sincerity. I never thought I'd say this, but I'm grateful to Victor, not for the money, but because his leaving brought you to me. Tanner's smile was slow and tender. I'd have found you somehow, Ruby Lane. Some things are meant to be. As spring transformed the land, bringing green shoots through the melting snow and new life to the dormant fields, Ruby and Tanner prepared for their journey to Denver. The ranch was left in Samuel and Edgar's capable hands, with promises to return within a month. Denver was a shock to Ruby's senses after the isolation of the ranch, the noise, the crowds, the constant activity overwhelming after so long in the quiet of their mountain valley. Tanner remained close by her side, a steady presence as they navigated the complexities of the legal system and banking procedures. The process took longer than anticipated: 3 weeks of meetings, document signings, and verifications, but the outcome was even better than they had hoped. With all fraudulent claims settled, Ruby found herself the legal owner of nearly $6,000, plus a small property in Denver that Victor had purchased. What do you want to do with the city property? Tanner asked as they walked arm in arm through Denver's bustling streets. Ruby considered the question. Sell it, she decided. Our future is at the ranch, but first, she added with a smile, I think we have a more important matter to attend to. That afternoon, they stood before a judge in a simple civil ceremony, exchanging vows and rings purchased with a small portion of Ruby's inheritance. As Tanner slid the gold band onto her finger, so different from the one Victor had given her, which now rested at the bottom of her trunk, Ruby felt the final pieces of her heart lock into place. I promise to love you faithfully, Tanner said, his voice steady and sure, to stand beside you through whatever life brings, to never betray the trust you've placed in me. Ruby, hearing the subtle reference to Victor's betrayal, squeezed Tanner's hands. And I promise to love you completely, she responded, to build our dreams together, to remember always that true strength comes not from never falling, but from rising together when we do. Their kiss, witnessed by strangers in a Denver courthouse, sealed a journey that had begun with betrayal and heartbreak, but had transformed into something stronger and more enduring than either could have imagined. The return to the ranch was a homecoming in the truest sense. As they crested the final ridge and the buildings came into view, the house, the barn, the new bunkhouse, all bathed in spring sunshine, Ruby felt a surge of emotion. "It looks different somehow," she said, reining her horse to a stop beside Tanner's. He nodded, understanding without need for explanation. "It's home now. Really home." Samuel, Edgar, and James emerged from the barn as they rode into the yard, their welcoming smiles turning to congratulations when they noticed the matching rings. "About time," Edgar said gruffly, but his weathered face creased with genuine pleasure. "We've been making some improvements while you were gone." The improvements were immediately evident: a new chicken coop, expanded garden plots, repairs to the corral, and most surprisingly, 6 young heifers grazing in the north pasture. "Bought them with the money you sent ahead," Samuel explained. Edgar said they'd be good breeding stock to start rebuilding the herd. That evening, sitting on the porch of what was now truly their home, Ruby and Tanner discussed their plans for the ranch. With the funds from Denver, they could expand properly: more cattle, better equipment, perhaps even hired hands beyond their current small family of workers. "I was thinking," Ruby said, leaning against Tanner's shoulder, "that we might offer Samuel and Edgar partnership shares. They've earned it with their loyalty." Tanner's arm tightened around her. "That's a fine idea. This place is big enough for all of us to build something worthwhile." Ruby tilted her face up to his. "I never imagined when Victor rode away that his betrayal would lead to this. That being broken could lead to being rebuilt into something stronger." "You were never truly broken," Tanner said, kissing her forehead. "Wounded, yes, but I saw your strength from the first day. All I did was hand you the tools you already knew how to use." "You did more than that," Ruby countered. "You showed me I was worth loving, worth fighting for. You picked up the pieces without asking anything in return." "And look what I got anyway," Tanner said, his smile tender in the fading light. "A ranch, a purpose, and the most remarkable woman I've ever known." As darkness settled over the valley, Ruby and Tanner Grayson sat together, planning their future on land that had witnessed both betrayal and redemption. The ranch that had once been a symbol of Ruby's broken dreams had transformed into the foundation of new one's dreams, built not on false promises and shallow desires, but on partnership, respect, and love that had been tested and proven true. When they finally rose to enter their home together for the first time as husband and wife, Ruby paused at the threshold. "Thank you," she said simply, Tanner's brow furrowed in question. "For what? For riding up that day, for staying when you could have left, for seeing value in what was broken." He lifted her into his arms, carrying her across the threshold with gentle strength. "I'm the one who should be thankful," he murmured against her hair. "I rode into this valley looking for temporary work and found everything I never knew I was searching for." As the years passed, the Lane Grayson Ranch grew and prospered. The small herd expanded, the fields yielded abundant crops, and the house that had once witnessed Ruby's despair now echoed with laughter, especially after the birth of their daughter Catherine in the spring of 1880, followed by twin sons Robert and Thomas 2 years later. Samuel and Edgar remained, transitioning from employees to partners, with James eventually marrying a girl from town and building his own cabin on the property. Together, they created not just a successful ranch but a family bound by choice rather than merely by blood. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Tanner surprised Ruby with a new front porch swing, handcrafted from local pine. As they sat together in the golden light of sunset, their children playing in the yard, Ruby reflected on the journey that had brought them here. "I used to think love was about grand gestures and promises," she said, watching Tanner's hand, work roughened but gentle as it covered hers. "Victor was full of those, but real love is in the quiet moments, isn't it? In showing up day after day, in rebuilding what's broken, in choosing each other even when it's difficult." Tanner nodded, his eyes following their daughter as she carefully collected wildflowers at the edge of the yard. "Love isn't just a feeling," he agreed. "It's a choice you make every day. And I choose you, Ruby Grayson, today and always." As the sun dipped below the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that rivaled the wildflowers in their daughter's small hands, Ruby leaned her head against Tanner's shoulder. From betrayal had come renewal, from heartbreak had come healing. And in the gathering twilight of a Colorado evening, surrounded by the life they had built together, Ruby knew with absolute certainty that some broken things, when mended with love and care, became stronger and more beautiful than they had ever been before.